there is a list up here. If you would like me to email this to you, just put your email on here and I'll email this to you, and I will send you this also if you'd like for that. And another plug for the Philadelphia 11 is there are books there that I'm able to order at a 40% discount for the Philadelphia 11. If you want to sign up for whichever titles that interest you, I will by April 1st, and then I will order them. And some of the other books and research things that are listed in the bibliography here, I brought also if you wanted to see where some of this information comes from. For that. So, we'll get started. All of this comes out of our social justice and racial healing group that started with taking sacred ground during COVID, during the pandemic. So, I mean, it wasn't just about black people and enslaved people, but sacred ground looks at indigenous people, it looks at Asian Americans, any kind of immigrant or anyone coming forward that joined in not necessarily the melting pot, what we would call the melting pot of the United States, but definitely the stew that we are today. And this research project comes out of, but we were really interested in it anyways because of Julie's research that we started following during the pandemic, was that there's a diocesan resolution going back to 2020 that asks every parish worshiping community in the Diocese of Connecticut to research our history, to see where we were as far as complicity with racism or sexism or any kind of ism where that fit in. So this is a tip of the iceberg for all of this. And when I taught history very briefly in my early teaching career, and I did not like history because it was, I know, and well now I say that, but because I was given a textbook, it said you are teaching to this textbook. I didn't learn any of this stuff, and so I didn't teach any of it either, which breaks my heart. But part of this now is because my family history is so connected to so much of this. My paternal line goes back to the 1600s in Connecticut. So you will hear my name mentioned, my family name Ely mentioned in this, and my direct ancestor lived in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. And there was a witness stone at the Florence Griswold Museum for an enslaved person that my ancestor enslaved. I discovered in all of this research. So, who was here first in this area? Long before colonists came, those who were explorers and came to this land. The first folks were Native Americans, indigenous peoples, and we believe, I mean, it's hard to figure out the exact people, but most likely they were what were known from the colonists as people of the shell. Who were the Siwanoi or the Siwanog, some people say, and these were part of the coastal Munsee tribe, which was part of the Lenape tribe, which we would say in English colonists' language, the Delaware tribe from that. So they spread up the East Coast, and we're probably at the very border of where they actually were here in Wilton and Norwalk. So we need to go back to these original people, and they lived, they moved inland from the water. They would fish. That was their main area of taking care of themselves, and they were very family oriented, and they moved inland from time to time from there. So right now in Norwalk, in East Norwalk, if any of you know where Veterans Park is, or where the Maritime Aquarium is, across from that, on Fort Point Street, which is across from Vets Park, there is an archaeological dig going on because a fort, an Indian fort, was discovered there some years ago. And so the state right now is doing that, so they're not letting anybody know what that information is that they're finding. But these were the people who lived on this land right now that we're still learning lots more. Around the 1600s, we're gonna say. We're gonna skip through history very quickly to give you I believe context is really important. Where did, as we move into looking at enslavement and what slavery was like, what contributed to that? What was it for? And a lot of it started very early on, way before colonists came here. Others came that enslaved people from a variety of areas. But in New England, the first slaves were Native Americans. They were captured as war prisoners. And during the variety of conflicts between the indigenous population and European settlers, and oftentimes it was over land. People coming in and settling on land that other people were living on, the indigenous people. The most well-known conflict in Connecticut was the Pequot War. Now, the Pequot War did not take place in this area. It was probably to the east of us and in the north of us. However, so this was 1636 to 1637, and a lot of it had to do with conflicts over land, trade, livestock, with the Pequots in the southeastern part of Connecticut. So think of New London, Mystic, Rhode Island area, and this is a woodcut of the English attack on the Mystic Fort Underhill in 1638. So this is the indigenous peoples where they were living, and these are the British, or the, surrounding them. And pretty much the war, as it culminated in a couple of treaties. One was the Treaty of Hartford, which outlawed the Pequot language and name, seized the tribal lands, and disbanded the surviving Pequot. So as the way to disband someone, a peoples that you're trying to get rid of, what do? You keep the women and children and enslave them, and you send the men off somewhere. And where they got sent to was called the Sugar Islands at the time, which we now call the West Indies. So all of those islands where we then got sugar cane growing and where we ended up getting molasses from those indigenous people, probably from the Pequot War or whoever was captured during that period of time. Let me go back just a second. And part of that then is, because I don't have a slide on that, but I do in the document, was more information on what was called the Middle Passage or the Triangle Trade, that hopefully we did learn in American history about that, and that what happened is Africans were captured or purchased in Africa and brought, most of the time they were brought to the West Indies or South America. Brazil had a huge population of enslaved folks. And as time went on, Africans came right to the New England area, but in the beginning they were brought to places like Barbados. And what happened is, in New England especially, those were looking for sugar. So the trade then would go to Barbados, pick up sugar, bring it, or molasses, and make for molasses so they could make whiskey and other kinds of things, or just have sugar, and England was definitely part of that. So there was this triangle of back and forth for goods, and what ends up happening is people, Africans, get caught in that as part of that trade. And that, it gets real complicated, but that's in the document. Skip ahead, not that much longer, to the purchase of Norwalk, and this is where my family's history comes in a little bit, because, oops, my documents are up here. There was the purchase of Norwalk, and what happened at that period of time is the Dutch were in New York area. And the Dutch were just interested in the land. They didn't care about anything. They were just conquering as they went and really eliminating a lot of the native peoples in the area. And there was a huge massacre in Pound Ridge, believed, at one period of time. So the colonists of Connecticut there were lots of people living in Fairfield and on the eastern coast. Think of Stratford. There's an early Episcopal Church in Stratford, all along that coast there. And so the colonial government in Connecticut asked people to come down and purchase land, so it would protect and have a buffer. Also, the farms in South Eastern Connecticut were wanting to expand. More people were coming in the area, they wanted land to live on, so the government sent some folks to buy the land. And the first one was Daniel Patrick, and he purchased land to the west of the Norwalk River. So that's probably from the Norwalk River to where Darien is today, that kind of area. And then soon after, Roger Ludlow came with my ancestor, Nathaniel Ely, and purchased land on the other side of the river toward Westport. So all of that became Norwalk. And at that time, Norwalk included Wilton. So Wilton's history is very much tied to Norwalk, and all the early records are a property of people, of churches where people worshiped, were all based on Norwalk's records for all of those. Then there was King Philip's War. And King Philip's War was in Connecticut again. And a lot of that had to do with, really affected Connecticut a lot, even though it was more again in Rhode Island area and coming eastward. But every town had to send 12 individuals to represent them to fight in King Philip's War. Now, King Philip was a Native American person really called Metacom, and what he wanted to do, it was all about land again too. But when the colonists, and you can see the triangles right here. I forgot I had that slide there. But by the end of this, and it pretty much wiped those people out too, and they were also then captured as enslaved people, as winnings from war. But around this period of time, at the end of the 17th century, that's when Massachusetts ships started going to Barbados or to Africa to follow on those. So lots of ports in Rhode Island and Connecticut started participating in those. So they were looking, they were looking to get things to help them grow their crops, so they would return with molasses, and as time went on, that's when human beings started to be imported, at least into Connecticut, in that period of time. So these are some statistics. I'm not sure if you can see them. I'll read some of them out. Chattel slavery, meaning the purchase of human beings and trading and selling of humans as property, began in 1643 in Connecticut. 1734, there are records of an enslaved person arriving in Wilton. So that would be the Wilton property. It was still part of Norwalk at the time, but it was in this upper land. And so think of Wilton as the outskirts of Norwalk from Chestnut Hill area forward, which is interesting because I live in Chestnut Hill area for that. Connecticut was the largest enslaver in New England. Fairfield County had more enslaved people than any other place in Connecticut, which is surprising, but that grew over time as in other places, and it was due to farming, most likely, in that area. There were some Connecticut tried to abolish slavery in a half-hearted kind of way. Most of the New England states had already abolished slavery, but Connecticut decided that they were going to slowly do it, and partly because it had to do with property, because people who were enslaved were property. They were listed on the records, and that's where Julie's found so much of this is, you've got your cow and your horse and your barn and, all your tools and everything, and then you list, oh, there's a person's name. And there's us. So they were found in property records, is where we know them in a variety of ways, or in people's wills that they would give them to their children. These people, they were property. But the Gradual Act in 1784 had that once a person turned, the names changed several times. I'm not going to go into some of the details. was that when they turned 21 or 25, if they were man or woman, but finally, it was if they were born after March 1st, 1784, on their 21st birthday, they would then be emancipated, so that was a manumission. They wouldn't be freed at that period of time. But if they were born before then, they were slaves, enslaved for the rest of their lives, no matter what, for that. So it was a gradual way, and the reason it was gradual is because people didn't want to give up their property. So they felt that this was another way. You're going to take away something that I owned and I worked really hard for. So history does repeat itself. That was an editorial comment. Sorry. So in 1809 is when emancipation, around that period of time we see that in Wilton. And John C. Wally, the person we sort of really recognize today and that we have recognized with our witness stone, he falls into that category. And his name was Lazarus. We know his name was Lazarus when he was enslaved. So what does a person do when you're suddenly free? You change your name. You own something new. You want to have ownership of who you are, which is agency. We'll get to that in a second. So by 1810, there were 8 enslaved people in Wilton. And the numbers are so interesting how they go up at certain periods of time, right before the Revolution, and then they go down. That again, that's in the document. So let's talk a little bit about what are the themes of slavery and what was enslavement like in Wilton. We're not growing cotton, we don't have plantations with hundreds and hundreds of slaves. But most people of means, and they believe in Connecticut, this area is very middle class. So even middle class folks enslaved others. Most doctors, lawyers, anybody of wealth in a town would own 1 or 2 slaves. That was just sort of the practice. But those enslaved people would do certain things. So one of a theme of slavery is dehumanization. If you're selling someone, you're treating them as property. You're not treating them as a human being. You're separating them from their homeland. Most likely, the enslaved people who were here, not Native Americans, who were here, probably have connections to Barbados and what would be in East Africa, Guinea, West Guinea, those kinds of areas, Liberia, those countries is probably where they come from. So if, DNA could test a lot of that stuff on this day. So anyways, they were treated as property. The other one is their treatment, being sold again, being whipped, and there are, or shackled. And there are stories of those things happening here in Wilton, in Norwalk also. Paternalism, which was really interesting in so many of the documents for me. Paternalism is when you are a father, and father knows best. So if someone is, for example, if there was a will from a man giving his property, including enslaved people, to his wife on his death, with the stipulation that when he died, a certain number of them were going to be, he wanted them to be emancipated, to be free. Well, the wife decided, once she got them, to ignore that part, because she felt that, especially the children that were involved, that she would keep them because that was for their own good, because they needed to be brought up to follow the Christian lifestyle and to be good citizens. And she could educate them, so they needed to stay with her and needed to stay enslaved for that. Then there is agency, which I've already said, why did they run away? They wanted their independence. That was how they could show agency, by running away. Or by not doing what they were supposed to do, what today we might call they were lazy. And that sort of perpetuates, that understanding has perpetuated itself. What can you do if you don't want to do that work? I'm going to take my time, or I'm going to do it poorly, and maybe they won't ask me to do it anymore. So that's a way of agency in figuring out, I'm going to control what I can control. I'm going to be sick a lot. All of those kinds of things was a way to show agency. And the humanists, think about all the things that we do to try to get out of something that we don't feel is fair for us. I mean, that's nothing compared to this. And then economics. Why hire people to till your land or wash your laundry when you can just have somebody do it for free? And we know in the South that was a huge piece. Not so much here. Around here, most those who were enslaved, if they were men, they were working on a farm. They were that person that helped do that, or take care of horses, those kinds of things. Women were household service. They might have done the cooking, the washing, the ironing, maybe taking care of the children, those kinds of things. So a household person. So when emancipation does end up coming, we see a lot of formerly enslaved people still living in those homes where they were enslaved, doing the same kind of things. And they might have been called servants, so they show up as servants. And even though they were free, there's some wiggle room in that, whether they were really fully emancipated or not, for those people. So let's go back a little bit in time to figure out, where does the church fit into all of this? Where do people of faith who believe in God, and that, well, maybe they didn't believe all the things, understand all the things that we do today, for sure, because we know Puritans came and settled in this country before anyone else, and their understanding of humanity is that we were sinful people. Puritans were pure, and so very strict in their beliefs and things like that. So in order for a colony to establish itself in a community, they needed to have a minister come with them. So every colony that was established, or town from the colony, would have a minister. So, and that would be the Congregational Church, but they would call it a parish. A parish is a piece of land that covers a certain area where a number of people live for that. So for Norwalk, their church is now on the Congregational Church is now on the green there, but it was probably in East Norwalk. The first settlements of Norwalk were along East Avenue. So if you know East Avenue, that goes from the center where the Norwalk Green is, town, past City Hall, over the bridge going toward the beach. That was the area that was populated first in Norwalk. Where out here was definitely the wilderness and territory for that. So the Congregational Church, they would have a meeting house. And in the meeting house, everything took place. Education, if the kids weren't in school or if there wasn't a schoolhouse or something built. But usually the meeting house was there for decision-making, law-making, but also for worship. It was one and the same. There was no real separation from church and state at all. We go into that a little bit more in my document about who was at the Congregational Church, what kinds of things they did, and then how Wilton breaks off from that. So you've got people that are living in Norwalk, but they might have farms in this area, or they might be very venturous and have come north. I should also say at one point that I didn't mention with the indigenous people, the Siwanoy and others who might have been, free at the time, they were moved around in Norwalk a lot as they lost their property. There was a place called Indian Fields around the Chestnut Hills area, and that's where they were moved. And the understanding is that they went willingly to that space, which I find hard to believe. But then as Norwalk started moving north more, and people started actually living in the Wilton area, they ended up taking those native people and moving them back down to Norwalk and putting them down near where Wilson's Point is. And at that time it was called Ely's Neck, which is I'm guessing at that time it was marshland and probably was not worth inhabiting. But it got them back to the sea, which is where they were, originally why they came to the area, because of fishing in this area. So the other part is there was another organization from the Church of England called the Society for the Propagation of the Christian Gospel, SPCK, for the knowledge of the Christian gospel, something like that. SPCK, and then that ended up morphing into SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. They sent missionaries to the colonies, Connecticut in particular. So one of the missionaries that they sent, and the reason for bringing them here was to make this a Christian place, to bring the Anglo view of what it means to follow Jesus, to grow an Anglo colony. It's written, very in your face, this is what we're doing. God is calling us to do this, to especially educate the gospel to Native Americans, enslaved people, and anyone else who is not following our ideals. And so it's a little hard to see in this image, but basically it's a minister standing at the bow of a ship with a Bible in his hand, and the people on the land saying, "Help us, help us." That is what was the Diocese of Connecticut, or now the Episcopal Church in Connecticut, that's its roots. The mission, when we talk about the Episcopal Church as the missionary society, it comes from SPCK, from that. That's the sort of the history of the Episcopal Church from its beginnings. Two people who are, and these are Anglicans, nobody's really Episcopal yet, and Episcopal means bishop, so that's sort of how, I guess we took that name, because we were separating from the Church of England at that time, who were called Anglicans, and we are Anglicans still too. So Dr. Jeremiah Leeming was one of the ministers called to Norwalk at St. Paul's Parish, at the time St. Paul's Anglican Church. And Jeremiah Leeming was a really interesting character. We know he enslaved one guy named Pomp, because there's later, and then he was probably also a Tory. Most of the folks that went to St. Paul's the Church of England folks, so they were probably Tories. And so at one point in time, when Tryon came through and then came back from Danbury and burned things along the way, he burned most of Norwalk down, including St. Paul's Anglican Church, these churches were all wooden structures. And you wonder why they started building them in stone. They would burn down all the time, or be burnt down. So Leeming, there's mixed stories of what happened to Leeming. He could have left Norwalk when the British withdrew, because that's when he seems to disappear. Leaves Pomp, and leaves all his papers, everything there. I'll let you read more about his story at another time. And then there's Samuel Seabury, who has connections to Norwalk also, when he was a priest of SPCK. He was a missionary sent also, but he was a missionary in New York area. But he would come here oftentimes. Anyways, both of them are up for the first bishop of Connecticut, because they wanted to send a bishop somewhere, because the English crown was not going to come and ordain bishops here. You had to go to England to do it, and England wasn't going to take these colonists to do it, even though both of them were probably Tories. Leeming was sick, older, so he was the first choice. Samuel Seabury was the second choice. He ends up going to Scotland and being ordained the first bishop for Connecticut in Aberdeen, Scotland. Samuel Seabury owned a number of slaves also. So, and there's lots of stories about him and his family over time doing that. So where does St. Matthew's, where do we come from then? Well, both for the Congregational Church in Wilton left Norwalk way before, I forget what the date that is, but 1726. It wasn't until much later, 1803 really, when St. Matthew's folks decided they wanted to form a parish. And what one had to do is you had to petition the colonial government in Hartford to say, we feel we have reason that we want to form our own parish. So we use the word parish as church these days, but parish was a government term of land area. So the Congregational Church they started theirs in Wilton much soon after, and a lot of it had to do with taxes too. Besides the place that you had to transport yourself, ride on your horse or walk, down Danbury Road into Norwalk to worship, but also governance. So there were a number of people of the Congregational Church in Wilton and St. Matthew's in Wilton, when they were part of those churches in Norwalk, before they existed here, they would collect taxes from the people who were living up here to pay down. So there was some taxes involved to pay for all the government. They end up breaking away and say, we're going to form our own. So St. Matthew's, the Anglicans who were at St. Paul's on the Green didn't want to, have to pay congregational taxes, but also there were enough of them here to be able to form their own parish here. So they petitioned to be able to do that. So all of that forming a new church, a new community had to go through the government, and that's how the churches also started in this area. These two drawings, I don't know how accurate these really are. These are found in a book that was written by David Close, who was a longtime member of St. Matthew's many years ago. And I think it was published in 2020. But I have no idea where these illustrations come from. Most likely it was, this is what most meeting houses looked like. But this was to be St. Matthew's for that. So then we get to the people of St. Matthew's, and I'm going really fast here, but hopefully you'll have questions. These are particular people that show up again and again in the records as being very influential at St. Paul's in Norwalk and also at St. Matthew's. And they are founders of Wilton themselves. We know the Lambert family really well. From houses and buildings in town and all kinds of things. And they were leaders in this community. They were Anglicans, they belonged to St. Paul's, and then they were founders of St. Matthew's. So that's the Lamberts on this, oh no, that's Belden's, my things are backwards. So let's talk about the Beldens first, because the Beldens were in Wilton before the Lamberts. Keep looking at Julie, make sure I'm getting correct me if I'm starting to go off on some stuff.
Lamberts are linked.
Yes, because everything is interweaved. And when you look at all the family records of these people, they all married each other too. So women's middle names are the same as somebody else. And most of, so here are the people that come to my mind that enslaved in Wilton. So this is the late 1700s for sure, into the 1800s. So the Nashes, and these show up on St. Paul's records a lot. I haven't met with the Congregational Church in Norwalk, but most were from the Congregational Church, which makes sense because they're the first ones that are established in the area to me. So Wilton enslavers included Nash, Keeler, Betts, Middlebrook, Gregory, Comstock, Marvin, Cannon, Raymond, Jessup, Abbott, who was the one who enslaved John C. Wally, and then Belden and Lambert. So those names sound, and Middlebrook. Did I not mention Middlebrook? Yeah. Okay.
The names of all our streets.
Yeah, so are those names familiar? Yeah. Yeah, so we're living among their this is sort of their legacy in much respect in many ways also. So Samuel, the Belden family goes back, way, way, way back, probably to the 1600s or something in Norwalk. So there's tons of stuff named Belden in Norwalk. These names are in Norwalk also. But the Beldens, it was, for both of these families, this was a family thing. Enslaved people got passed on from father to son, to son, to son, to son, and sometimes to daughter. But mostly
Wedding gifts, usually
wedding gifts or other kinds of giving a child to one of your teenagers or something that were enslaved. So the Beldens, Samuel Belden II in particularly, has a connection to a lot of these people who have real strong connections to St. Matthew's in some way, and we'll get to that in a second. So Hagar, a lot of biblical names too, don't know, so you know that they probably didn't choose these names. Hagar was born in probably around 1770, and she ends up dying enslaved. But she had a number of children, and they were all enslaved, but many of them were emancipated because of that gradual act of emancipation in 1784. Hagar may be buried in our cemetery. I mean, we don't know where for that, and there's a little map in the document that shows our cemetery. A couple years ago, a group of us went to the cemetery to wander around and say, there's a little line in the plot that says colored. What does that mean? There's another little line that says strangers. What does that mean? And then there are some people buried in there who show up in the next couple of slides, who were most likely were black, probably African descent, probably, or from Barbados or something like that. Or were formerly enslaved there, but they, were freed at that time, that have stones in our cemetery. Anyway, so there are lots of Tonquins, Tonquin, and Bill Tonquin was probably a Native American, and he was owned by a different Belden. So a variety of lots of Belden families that were all related, whose slaves interconnected with each other and had children or not. And then there were the Lamberts, who came, I believe, from Western Massachusetts, if I remember. And David Lambert II in particular was very instrumental with the founding of St. Matthew's, and he was like a warden at St. Paul's on the Green, or St. Paul's Anglican Church at the time. And there are documents of him buying enslaved people that we have found. So they enslaved Jack, Coffee or Cuffy, Peg, and possibly another man, because he was even though he should have been born as a free individual, somehow one of the Lamberts gives him to his daughter. So how could that be? That's kind of confusing in that. But let's see. Major Samuel Belden II was the first junior warden of St. Matthew's. Captain Samuel Belden was a founder of St. Matthew's. He gave a plot of land 50 feet by 65 feet in 1802 to build the church structure across from his tavern on Old Highway Road, Danbury Road, which is where the brick church, which was the Baptist church, former St. Matthew's, that location there. And his son was the first junior warden. David Lambert II served as clerk when Wilton petitioned to separate from Norwalk. He was later a lister or assessor and selectman. That was the tax collector. So he would collect, when they were at St. Paul's, they'd collect the taxes from the people in this area, and that in particular for that. David Lambert II was also an organizer of St. Matthew's and has served as a clerk and collector for the church. The Lambert family in general and their children paid a good portion of the salaries of the early rectors and contributed greatly to the construction of the first church building. There was one thing I read was that the Lamberts, in paying the salaries and we shared clergy lots of times. There was a period of time when whoever was the minister here was also like a quarter time in Ridgefield. Or we shared sometimes with St. Paul's on the Green. I mean, everybody they were itinerant. They were moving all over the place. However, the Lambert family, in paying, I forget which minister it was, it had to do with depending on how they were giving their services, or which I took as depending on how they preached, whether you'd get paid or not. Did you get that? No. I thought we needed a little joke, so. But it's not. It doesn't work that way anymore.
Just be aware.
John James Lambert, who's David II's son, donated 1 acre of land in 1815 that ends up becoming St. Matthew's, the beginning of St. Matthew's Cemetery. And I believe the Lamberts are all buried in the cemetery there, too. And we don't know if this grandson now, this third generation, enslaved anyone, but he certainly grew up in a household in which there were a number, at least 4 enslaved individuals at the time for that. And this is an image from the Wilton Historical Society of the deed for the sale of Jack from Joshua Jennings, who I think was in Fairfield, I don't remember where, to David Lambert, May 9th, 1757. So this is the senior Lambert. For 65 pounds for a certain Negro man called Jack, about 35 years of age. And we have a couple of these kinds of documents of transfers of property, deeds of sale. And then we have, and we've, hopefully all of you are sort of familiar, I feel like I know John C. Wally after all of this time, that, you know, he was enslaved as Lazarus. Through so many documents that Julie had, we learned that he, once emancipated, he changed his name, he was married here, he had a son who was baptized here. We later discovered he had a daughter who was older than that son, so I don't know why we didn't hear about Betsy before we heard about Solomon, or Samuel. His name was Samuel Solomon. But these are in our record, our registers. This morning I forgot, I was going to go in and grab some of our registers so you could actually see what a register looks like, because we still, and Marissa's getting up. What I used to like to do with confirmands is see if their families had been members here a long time, to go back and see if we could find when they were baptized. So when you're baptized, confirmed, married, buried from a church, it gets put in these records, and these are documents that stand the test of time. Reading these old ones are, I don't know how you read them all, because I tried reading them, and they're all in handwriting. You can't, you know, they're really hard to read. But they track a lot of things. So also property records. We learned that, I think it's Daniel Belden, one of the Beldens, who was a member of St. Matthew's also, was it Belden or another person? Betts, Daniel Betts, who was, for some reason, he became an Episcopalian, and although the Betts families were Congregationalists. And he lived near the Church of St. Matthew's, and he had a stable with horses. He seemed to have been a benefactor for John C. Wally, and he employed Wally to take care of his horses and things like that. But he also sold him a piece of property, and that building still stands at 232 Danbury Road, which was just in a did you know kind of thing from the Wilton Historical Society. So go back and look, if you follow social media, you'll see that they have a great post that mentions St. Matthew's in it for honoring John C. Wally. And his witness stone is at the Historical Society. We felt, as a group, we said, where do we put this stone? Because lots of churches or organizations put them where the person worshiped, lived, or worked. And we know John Wally worked for St. Matthew's because there is a record in our book that he got paid $9 for ringing the bell, sweeping the floor, and stoking the fire. So he was like the sexton, which we would call sexton. He took care of the property, and he probably dug graves, most likely, because that's what they did then too. So we have those in the record for that. And he lived there, so he bought a piece of property, he later sold it, and then he disappeared. And so John Mannix and Doug Gubner, thank you, looked at lots of this research, and Doug wrote a biography for John C. Wally, and you can read that, it's quite funny. And know, all of you who know Doug. And, but a fun thing, I'll sort of share a little bit is when I like to do genealogy, so that's another reason why I think I've been drawn to this, is I put together a family chart through Ancestry.com just to see it, lay it out, because the kids were getting confused as to how so-and-so related to so-and-so and all of that. And so I put that in, and I knew John C. Wally's wife, I knew their marriage date, and I knew when their son was baptized. So I put that into Ancestry.com, left, whatever, to do something else, and a couple days later I go back to clean it up, to print it out, to bring for the kids, and there's a little green leaf next to Betsy's name. And I'm like, what is this? So I open it up, and there's this, not Betsy's name, Harriet's name, his wife, sorry, and realize there's her where she's buried, and it's Bridgeport. It's not that far. I emailed Julie right away, and Julie gets right to the case, goes, and she found John Wally's death record. So we know he died in Bridgeport. So he chose to move. We often wonder why, but he chose to do that. Right, that's right. It was soon after Daniel Betts died for that too.
Nobody picked up the slack.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's probably a story there, for sure. So I glommed so much off of Julie for all of these things. So Julie put together some amazing documents, and these are one of the diagrams. So these are free Black Wiltonians post, everyone's been emancipated at this period of time in the 1800s. Although there are some still, like Hagar, is still enslaved in this.
Some of these are born free. Charlotte was born free. I'm quite a number.
Right. So a lot of them are born free. She was saying. But in looking through them, if you'll see on this map, here's Danbury Road. Here's Wolf Pit. So St. Matthew's currently is around here somewhere. The old St. Matthew's is probably around here. And all of these diagrams are where freed Blacks were living. Then I looked up through our records that Julie had done, all the different people who were baptized here, confirmed here, were communicants or members here, baptized, married, or buried. And this is how many of those free Black families are associated with St. Matthew's. A lot. Wow. Which tells me, this is just my opinion, that St. Matthew's was a welcoming place for these folks. And or the clergy, that we named a lot of clergy, but these in particular, the clergy during these particular times ministered to these folks through sacraments of the church for them, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, you can add Jacob and Dorcas at Rush. Their daughter Harriet is the one who married John.
Right. Oh, so that family, yeah. And
I have a connection.
Okay.
You don't really want Jacob though.
Right.
He was not.
That's a really interesting story about John Wally's wife Harriet and the family that she came from. Lots of really good, interesting stories in these.
So which building is the Wally family? You said it was 252?
232. So you've got St. Matthew's,
Yeah.
St. Matthew's, then you've got the cemetery,
Yeah.
the police station, the cemetery, and the Wally's house is sort of in
It's kind of
between.
a pale blue color. It used to be, I think, like a bulldog anchor or something.
Right,
Realty
on the
center.
bulletin board in the hall,
It's the realty center.
yeah, there's a big, and it sold recently for, I don't know how many $1 million. And Wally bought it and sold it for
A few hundred,
a
but
few hundred, yeah.
when Bet sold it to him, he sold it for about $100, and then just a decade later, he sold it for 4 times that much. So it appears, I looked at inflation rates in that time period. It didn't go up; it went down slightly. So the house shouldn't, and population levels didn't change dramatically. It shouldn't have appreciated like that. reached is that Betts probably gave him a very good price. He also rather redundantly left it to John in his will as if he still owned it, which is, it's a good thing that he had actually given it away because he was in debt when he died.
Yeah, and so Betts was thought enough to say, okay, I'm giving, or I'm letting this, I'm selling this piece of property to this formerly enslaved person. If I die, I need to leave some more proof that I know I did this
Just
on
in
purpose,
case.
just in case, for
But it
that.
sounds like earlier, they didn't necessarily follow the wills. If somebody was freed and someone in the family didn't agree with that, they would just keep the slave. So did times change and people started following wills more, or?
Well, technically they were always supposed to, but of course, you know, the will is what the person dying ideally wants to happen. There's gonna be probate courts involved, there's gonna be the fact, if you're in debt, like Betts was, what you wish for doesn't really matter, because there's nothing to leave anyways.
I see.
So there's always that possibility. But yeah, sometimes nobody really cared what happened to these enslaved people. You know, the probate judge isn't gonna do anything.
Yeah,
The
and they had no
community isn't
legal
gonna do anything.
representation.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the probate judge would look the other way, because we have stories of that are connected to the Church of Latter-day Saints and the Manning family. That's a whole nother interesting path to study, is that family and how they were emancipated, they were free people, but didn't have the papers. And Erastus Sturgis, who was the person at the time, was a member of St. Matthew's, didn't acknowledge that they were free, and so they got stuck where they were. That's enough, that comes later in this history. So the history I looked at went up to 1830. There is still more after that.
And actually, if you go back to that picture of the interior of St. Matthew's, it would be extremely interesting to know how accurate that is. Because one thing to notice about it, there's the enclosed expensive pews on the bottom. You can see above there's a balcony. So yes, black folk in town were marrying, they were being buried, you know, these things were happening, but it is not equal. There is separation. They're gonna be up in those balconies, even though they're being buried, some of them in St. Matthew's Cemetery, there is a colored section, so they are not with everybody else.
And unmarked graves.
Yeah.
So that's-
Where else would they be married, Julie?
Where else would they be buried? Spruce Bank Cemetery.
Do you wanna talk about that?
Sure.
I'm sorry, I meant married.
Oh, married.
What-
Well, they could have been married, well, they're kind of an itinerant preacher, Methodist, who would come around up on Hurlbut Street, which I love telling people this used to be called Hurlbut's Hole, but the Methodist preacher didn't like that, he thought it was too suggestive, so they changed it. Sorry, levity, we need a little levity. These are serious times. So, oh, yes, I understand. So yeah, there were lots of different church options in town, especially as you get later. I mean, early on, the only in town was really the Congregationalists. But for a lot of people who were enslaved, the marriage ritual was, you know, or even the institution of marriage, in some cases, it was a little less formal. So it would necessarily be consecrated in a church. It might be an informal arrangement that, you know, two owners came up with, or that the enslaved people themselves worked out on their own, sometimes with the approval of their owners, sometimes with, you know, a little more independence than that. So yeah, there were always options.
And
But,
we know
yeah.
John C. Wally was married twice. So there's a record of him being married, and then to Harriet, and then like 2 months later or 3 months later, he's married in St. Matthew's records by Origin, whatever his name is.
Yeah, so he's in the town vital records, so he was recorded as being married, according to town records, and then he's also recorded as being married in the church records. It's possible it's referring to a singular event, but it is recorded twice and with different dates. So,
Which totally the young people were totally confused as that. Why would he get married twice? It didn't take the first time. So explaining that difference between churches, and a lot of people do that today. We'll get, a civil ceremony and then get blessed.
So it's possible that happened. It's also extremely possible that it's simply a record-keeping error, that the date discrepancy isn't real. It just got written down incorrectly by someone. And in fact, we know that it's looking at the records that we have. So many are missing. Just to begin with, we just don't have them. St. Paul's Church in Norwalk, some of its early records are just, we don't have them anymore.
They burned.
They're gone. Whose records got eaten by a mouse? Was that the Congregational Church in Norwalk? Somebody got it. They're gone. Mouse ate them all. So hungry little mouse. I think we had a lot of time too.
Very hungry.
Very hungry little mousey. But yeah, so as many names as we're seeing here, and we're looking at these people and going at the Lamberts and saying, oh, okay, well we have records of 4 individual people, and we have 2 records, one from 1757, one from 1760, saying David Lambert Sr. bought enslaved people at that time. Well, that's a single snapshot. When we say, oh, people in Connecticut, they owned like 1 or 2 slaves, 1 or 2 at a time, not 1 or 2 over their lifetime. What we've actually got written records of is probably just scratching the surface at the scale of what happened here. So this is big. When it comes to Spruce Bank, which has recently been confirmed that we have 8 burials. Technically, the scientists they always want a little, wiggle room, so it is probable burials is what they're technically at this time. Those burials represent, in terms of physical area, about 1/10 of what the size of this cemetery should be. That is judging on the 1749 initial land record, and then 2 subsequent land records that say that 1 rood, which is about 1/4 of an acre, is reserved for the cemetery. And that's how big it was in 1749, 1/4 of an acre. And that doesn't account for the fact that possibly over time, this place was in use until 1878 at the latest. Over time, it may have grown in size. So we have found 8. There may be many more. Something to keep in mind right now about the status of this site. You can see these, they might be hard to see, but there's a black box here, and there's a black box here. That means that this area and this area, we conducted GPR survey on. We did not look here, we did not look here, we did not look here. We can't under the house, right? We didn't look over here. There's a lot of territory there that we did not have grant funding to look at, or where the territory is simply too steep. Not too steep for burials. Harriet Wally, her grave in Mountain Grove Cemetery in Bridgeport, I swear the land is about 45 degrees. It is really steep. You can bury on pretty steep land, particularly if your funding is not such that you can buy a nice flat grave, which John apparently could not purchase, but also if you happen to be an enslaver and you're simply looking to get rid of a body, you're gonna put it pretty much anywhere you want. Probably the cheapest area possible, which Spruce Bank is. It's a cemetery that has a lot of land that would not be considered prime. So there are more burials. I'm sure it's going to be a matter of have they been preserved. This is a very disturbed site. You've got just off the screen here, you have Route 7. Route 7 has widened by up to something like 50 feet over, since 1899, when we have the first actual, transportation department survey showing its route. It has widened at least 50 feet since that time. So as close as these are about 20 feet from the sidewalk. And much of this area, as you see, because it's too steep, we couldn't survey. There could be burials there. We could be driving over people when we go on Route 7. It's entirely possible. From the accounts that we have of David Herman Van Hoosier, who was a local historian writing in the late 1800s or early 1900s. He's a very frustrating and annoying man. He's extremely racist, but he was interested. This is something our town has that most towns do not have. Somebody who wrote extensively and took a lot of notes about Black Wiltonians, both free and enslaved. He was interested. The stories he tells are usually with a punchline. So he's going to tell you about Jack Tonquin, but the point is, oh, he could do X, Y, and Z, or he was drunk all the time, or he shot the neighbor's dog because he liked his cat and his rooster, and the dog attacked the cat, and oh, isn't that funny? Well, you come out of this and you don't know a lot about Jack, except that, well, he liked cats, which I identify with. We know that, but you don't know him. You just get him as this kind of comic figure who is happy with his situation. He's a happy drunk. We all love him, but do we actually know him? Do we actually care about him enough that he even gets a headstone when he gets buried? No. He is buried in St. Matthew's. We know that. We have the records. For none of his siblings, we don't know where any of them are buried. We don't know, and this is all the family that was enslaved by the Beldens. We do not know for sure where any of them are. If you look at Van Hoosier's notes, he says, oh, some of them are rumored to be in St. Matthew's, but then 2 pages later, the same name, rumored to be in Spruce Bank. They might be here.
Sorry, where is Spruce Bank?
Spruce Bank is at 331 Danbury Road. It's where Regency Limo used to be.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's right across from the
Sawmill, right?
Sawmill,
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is where, who owned, the person who gave the plot for Spruce Bank owned the mill, right?
Yeah.
It's all connected somehow.
Yeah, well, it was originally, before it was ever owned individually, it was a cemetery. So in 1749, the town of Norwalk, the proprietors of Norwalk, they take this chunk of land, which was at the time about 3 acres in size, and it was commons, so it was owned by everybody. And during the time it had been commons, one thing you could do in commons is you can start up a cemetery, just anyone can. So somebody did. It could have been the Belden family, they were in that area. It could have been the Sloan family or the Cole family. All of those names were very early settlers right in that area. And because of the age of this place, it's, I think, something to keep in mind that burial practices early on in enslaving families, it's not probably just their enslaved people buried here. Some Beldens are probably in there too. So it's a very complex and disturbing sight, but we shouldn't just look at it and feel depressed. We should also look at it and say, so much of Black history has just been paved over, sometimes extremely literally paved over. Parts of this one have probably been paved over, but we've got an opportunity here to draw attention to this one, to save at least part of it. Even if we never find a single additional grave, we know we've got part of it here, and we can do something with that. We can talk about it, we can think about it, and we can consider some of the lives that may or may not be buried there, but we know who are living around here in the time. Going back to the Tonquin family, okay, so there's lots of depressing things about them, but you can also get hints that they were really interesting people with big personalities. Yes, there's the stories that are complicated and compromised from Van Hoosier, but there's also the fact that somehow every single one of them managed to avoid the census taker, like almost every single time. Why did they do that? Other Black people in town were getting counted, but we know they're here. I've got records of them buying things like Nancy Tonquin, Holder Hill Lane, you've all heard of that? That's okay. That used to be Black Nancy Lane because she lived there. That's what everybody called it. So Nancy would go down. She was married to Harry and Marvin, who used to be enslaved by the Marvin family. Shocking, right? She would go down to Cannondale, and there was a store there, and she would buy things, and then she would go back up. But, so I know she's there, but she just avoids the census taker. So you wonder, there's so many
explanations for why this could be, but you put that together with the fact that the whole lane is named after her, and you start to suspect she's got a big personality, people know her, people think about her, and they're probably thinking annoying things, but she's making a mark. She's living life, at least to some degree, on her own terms. She's got agency. And the same thing with her brother, all of those stories. You know, this is a guy that people knew. This is somebody that people paid attention to, even if he had to make compromises, even if he had to live a life that was at least partially circumscribed by how everybody else saw him and how everybody else thought he should act. He still managed to, in some ways, be himself. And then there's all of the people who, frankly, chose to practice their agency by getting excuse me, I'm gonna swear in a church, by getting the hell out of Dodge. Dodge being Wilton, the Manning family. They left in the early 1840s. When they left, the black population of Wilton dropped by like 15%. It just plummeted because so many of them left in one fell swoop. And when they did that, they were going off to join the Mormon Church. Many of them had already joined the Mormon Church, but they were going to join the community of Mormons out in Illinois or Indiana at that time. I can never remember where it was. Yeah, it's the Midwest. I have a mental block about the Midwest. So they were heading out. I'm from Seattle. Oh, I know. So they were heading out there, and when they did that, they were moving forward, but at the same time, they were separating themselves from something which, at least that family, seems to have felt was holding them back, at least spiritually holding them back. One of the things Jane says, Jane Manning, the one who leads this charge, the daughter of the family, she says that when she joined a church in New Canaan for a while because she was a servant over in New Canaan to a family, the Fitch family. And she says, like, okay, I went to the church service, but I felt there should be something more. It wasn't enough, it wasn't right. And maybe it's that the family that she was working for said, you better join this church. You know, you're getting a little older here, you gotta get some religion, you need to join this church. But then this traveling preacher comes by and he gives a sermon and it hits the spot for her, it inspires her. So she chooses to leave. She convinces the rest of her family and they go. Now, the whole family was clearly religious seekers. The number of different church memberships they had over the years in this area, like we've got one baptized Methodist and we've got, over here somebody else and over here somebody else, and they finally converge on Mormonism. And they leave. When they leave, the story that Sharon already mentioned of Erastus Sturgis, who was an important member of St. Matthew's. He had been the first selectman of the town, and at the time Jane and her family reached out to him. He was a judge. He was the obvious person a justice of the peace, the obvious person that she needed to turn to, that the family needed to turn to for their free papers. They were all free. Almost all of them had been born free, except Jane's mother. But without an official document signed by, some random white man that the person 3 states over has never met in person, but by the fact that they write Justice of the Peace after their name and you assume they're white, you're gonna believe them over these people who are speaking to you in person. He refuses to give this document because, according to Van Hoosier, so we gotta take it with a grain of salt, but according to him, he felt offended. We've done so much for their family, for the Mannings. We've given them everything, we've treated them well, and they're leaving us for Mormonism? Oh dear. Yeah. So, this kind of attitude that even when you are someone like Sturgis, who had a relationship with the Mannings previous to them leaving, and it was probably a fairly positive one. he probably, you know, even if he didn't benefit them directly, he was at least neutral towards them. With Betts, we know he was positive towards John. He helped him. But even when you have that relationship, there's this expectation. Oh, I helped you. Well, it's because I am a superior being of some sort. You are clearly inferior, and you better like it, whatever I'm giving, and you better not turn it away. You better stay in your place. That is underneath all of the good things that we see with St. Matthew's in this time, with the Congregational Church this time, with so many. Everyone is compromised. Everyone is complicit.
Yes.
And it's very frustrating, but it's a truth that we have to recognize.
Other questions?
Yeah.
I have a very narrow
Sure.
question for you. I've done some work in archives in
Yeah.
Virginia,
Ah.
and thankfully, Virginia required the registration of their free black population.
Wonderful. Yeah.
After Gabriel's rebellion, they
Yeah.
realized that it might be nice to know who's who. So they required every April
Mhm.
for so-called free blacks
Yeah.
to report to the county to
Yeah.
be identified. So thankfully, we have these narrative mugshots.
Yeah.
So I happen to know exactly how tall my fifth great grandmother was,
Wonderful.
where
Yeah.
the burns were on her arms, and most importantly, who she chose to go to the courthouse with.
Yes.
So people went in clusters
Yeah.
of family. Better still, they're required to bring documentation of the source of the manumission. So
Mhm.
I happen to know
Wonderful.
that Betsy Randolph was born free in 1812,
Yeah.
but others were manumitted by will
Mhm.
or mostly by will. So the question is,
Yeah.
did Connecticut track the free black population?
No, they did not, and which is surprising given how terrified they all were up here about slave rebellions and, you know, what the possibility of, you know, free black people joining together and doing who knows what. You know, there was a lot of concern about that. If you go to the newspapers, and particularly in the later 1700s and early 1800s, there was just detailed and kind of frothing at the mouth coverage of whatever the latest slave rebellion, you know, in the West Indies or in the South was. So they were very concerned, but for whatever reason, they never did this full registration of free people. For the way that you get the piece of legislation in Connecticut that produces the most archival evidence of, you know, ages and things like that is that 1784 law that says, okay, if you were born after March 1st, 1784, now March 1st thing is funny, the year used to begin on March 1st, not January 1st. That's why, like, Abraham Lincoln back in the day was like inaugurated March 4th, I don't remember that because it's my birthday. So yeah, so that piece of legislation, because it was tied to their specific age, suddenly produces all of these records of the exact birth date of people. So we know exactly when John, Richard, and two of the other Tonkins were born. We've got the exact date. Two of them were born on March 6th. Something was going on 9 months before March 6th that really got that family going. So we have that information, but for so many people, if they were born one day earlier, we don't have it. And also, not every town clerk cared to enforce this. So if you go over to Reading, you don't find any records of these births at all. They just never bothered to write them down. They didn't care. Either they just assumed that, oh, the slave owners will regulate themselves, which is always a great decision. Or they said, you know, I'm just going to be enslaved for life. And you have these, since we're so close to New York State here, by the way, New York had legal slavery for life longer than Connecticut did. So there's this period of time in the 1780s and 1790s, even into the very early 1800s, where something that happens in this area is that you get a slave owner who has a enslaved child who was born after that March 1st date, and they say to themselves, well, I don't feel like I'm going to get a full return on my investment.
Remember the property piece?
Yes. If I have to give Grace or Pompey up when they turn 21, that's not fair to me. So they sell them out of state to New York. Very convenient here.
Jeez.
So there's one bit of good news there, though it didn't end well in most cases. There was a man up in Reading. His name was Isaac Hillard. He was one of 2 people in this entire state, and the enslaved people couldn't take anyone to court on their own. They had to have a champion, basically. They had to have somebody take the court to go to the court for them. Isaac did that. He did that for about, I think it's 5 or 6 cases. One of only 2 people in all of Connecticut who did this. And he sued people for this. There is one case where it was Stephen Betts of Reading, and he had enslaved Tamar, and her son, who was an infant, named Amos. And then also living in town was her father, Harry, who was enslaved in another household. In this court case, where Tamar and Amos were sold out of state by Stephen Betts and Hillard is suing, they're already gone. Nobody knows where they are anymore. All you could possibly do is punish Betts. They're gone. But what we have, so unusually, we actually have Harry's testimony. Him saying, this is exactly what happened, this is what my daughter told me she feared was going to happen, this is what happened when I hid in the kitchen and listened to them talking about how the sale was going to go down, this is what happened when my daughter ran away to Newtown and then was recaptured, and this is how I feel about it now. And then on top of that, Hillard facilitated Harry and 2 other enslaved individuals. We don't know where they were from. They had names that were very common. I think it was Caesar and Cato, but we know it was this Harry. He facilitated and helped them write a petition to the state legislature to change the law to make it enforceable, because there was already law saying you couldn't sell people out of state like this. It was law, but it was not practical to enforce. So he tried to get the law changed. So there's these stories like mixed in with all the negatives. Don't lose the humanity of the people involved and how much they kept fighting and kept trying to make things better. And that's really important.
Thank you. Marissa, did you want to?
So this is the kind of book that you all are in. We have 2 of these. Some of you are going to be in this one and some of you are in the next one. But in the 1940s, St. Matthew did an interesting thing, which is why you can check the records without actually being here. You handed over your books, and they were copied, and they live somewhere else now. But this is this is the book that John C. Wally's family is in, and I'm gonna put it maybe on the back table. There's a couple of different references, but this one that's marked here is the baptism of Samuel Solomon Wally.
Wow.
In your book. On the same page, by the way, as quite a few Betts who were baptized as well. So these books, they tell the story. You all are in the same kind of book, in the same kinds of ways that Sharon mentioned. But you can come take a look at this. It's right down here at the bottom of the page, and you can find Samuel's little baptismal record right there. And give thanks for the fact that in the 40s, people thought it was a good idea to take these records and copy them and send us back these books, which are a little newer, a little harder to read. But that's exactly why Julie and Sharon and everybody else had to take a look at these records without coming here. They're public property now.
The originals are in the Connecticut State Library out in Hartford.
And then on top of that, they've all been digitized, so they were, by the Connecticut State Library, they were put on microfilm. Now the microfilm has been digitized. All hail the Mormons again, by the way, because it is the Mormons and their extreme interest in genealogy that has made that available. So through Family Search, .org, and then also Ancestry, which they own as well. You can go on for free and you can look at all these records and read about your church back in the day.
Steve?
If I may just ask Julie, Sharon, did I understand correctly, the 1848 law was supposed to free all enslaved people?
Yes.
Was there also, did you say, a law in place before that you could not sell people out of state?
Yes.
When did that law take effect?
Oh, goodness.
Hang on.
Yeah,
I have that in here.
Well, the follow-up question was gonna be, do you have evidence that after 1848, in the same way that you described it after
Yeah.
1784, people who had been enslaved still stayed in a kind of
Yeah.
quasi-slave status?
Yeah. Maybe you guys can finally tell me how to say his name. It looks like Onesimus? Onesimus. Okay, he lived in New Canaan, and he is on the 1850 census. It says voluntary slave. He was enslaved by the Comstock family. He was quite elderly at that time, so this whole, and you know, you kind of guess that Phoebe Comstock, who would have been his primary enslaver at that point, that she was probably standing right over his shoulder when this was written down. Don't even know if he said, that's what I am, or if she offered that up for him. But New Canaan and its histories, like if you actually go on findagrave.com right now and you look up, he went by One, if you look up One Comstock's grave, the description under it right now says that, you know, he had this great relationship with Comstocks, he loved being their slave, and he wouldn't go free even, you know, when he had the opportunity. It's still there, and it's copied almost verbatim from an 1850s newspaper article about him. So there is this urge, and it's not just New Canaan, though I really want to point my finger at them because they've got several instances of this, but Van Hoosier did it for us. You know, he looks back at the people who were enslaved here and said, oh, it wasn't that bad. They had fun. They enjoyed it. They got benefits out of it.
They learned a skill.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, they learned a skill, yeah. And, okay, did it ever occur to these people who were writing it that the power imbalances were still so stark that if you went as Van Hoosier, or you went as this earlier historian, and you talked to Jack Tonquin, or you talked to any of these other individuals, that they might not be telling you what they feel, but they might be telling you what you want to hear.
Oh, absolutely.
For their own safety.
Yeah.
For their own safety. And also just not even safety, but just convenience.
Yeah.
Do you really want to like debate slavery with Van Hoosier, or do you just want to believe what you believe and let him do what he wants to do? You know?
Go on, get along.
Yeah.
Two quick questions about
Sure.
interpretation.
Yeah.
The first is, when I was in Virginia, the Tonquin Historical Society,
Yeah.
assumed that the free blacks had lives relatively lack of restraint because there were no records
Yeah.
that they reported every April to be identified
Yeah.
until the right librarian at the state library showed me the book. And I spent a week transcribing
Yeah.
evidence of families
Yeah.
who every year
Yeah.
brought themselves to be identified.
Yeah.
That's looking one way. The other way, the first European fell out of the family tree in at the Schomburg Library in 1972, and frankly, I wasn't thrilled because my fifth great grandmother was in a household of a white carpenter, and only when I decided to approach it as an historian, I realized that she bore 17 children by this carpenter. My grandmother told the story of being a child in Richmond who spent her summers going from household to household with her cousins out in the county. The houses were built without nails, and I subsequently found that all of these uncles were carpenters. Well, so was their father. So how do you interpret a couple who weren't allowed to marry legally, who raised 17 children together, whose sons were taught dad's trade, and upon the father's death, there were court papers that documented the attempts of his family to reclaim property from my grandmother, who had been sold his property for $1 because you couldn't inherit property. So my initial assumption, which was that racism trumps everything else, had to be modified somewhat, because people, despite the laws that govern their lives, are people.
Absolutely.
I'm sure that it wasn't an equal marriage, but
No marriage was back then. But what you're talking about there and looking at the probates, like when you really look at what happens when somebody's dead and they don't know if anyone's judging them anymore, that's where the real stuff comes out. So when you have a family like yours, where the family, the wife, the kids, they got the property, not all the other relatives. They got it. That says something. It really does. Because one of the tropes within New England slavery is that, oh, well, people up here, since they only had 1 or 2 enslaved people at a time, they were part of the family. They lived in the house, they ate the same food, they went to the same church. We loved them, they were part of the family. And you can even go to accounts that were written by former enslaved people from this area, and they will make reference. They will say something like, I grew up in the family of, and then they'll say the name of the enslaver. A lot of those sources were written for a white audience, trying to convince them that, abolition was a good cause. There's that. But when you really look at the probates, what happens when you die? Where does the money go? Well, we have an example in Wilton that I think is very illustrative of this. It was one of the Middlebrooks, and he died very early 1800s, something like 1810. When he died, his enslaved person, former enslaved, he was actually free at that time. His name was Pompey Caesar, and my husband points out that Pompey and Caesar didn't like each other, so this is a great name. But Pompey Caesar got $100. That's a sizable amount at this time. It's pretty good. And so whenever I tell people about this, they all look hopeful, like, oh my God, is there a moment where somebody did something right? And then you learn, well, Middlebrook's daughter, 2 daughters, each got property in cash worth $2,000 apiece. The sons, $4,000 apiece. So, okay, family, something between stranger, acquaintance, and family. It's a different category. So they're living in the household. You might use that word, but it's not meaning the same thing. Absolutely. The probates do not lie.
Well, thank you all for sticking around and everything. So check out the book in the back, and if you want a copy of this that goes into a lot more of the details that I just kind of flew through, just add your email address and I'll email it to you. And at some point, I'm guessing we'll put it up on a link on our website.